Thank you, first of all, everyone, so much for being here. I am just blown away by the enthusiasm for Startupy, and I can't tell you how energized and motivated I am to build this thing thoughtfully and slowly and intentionally. Before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to my almost 90-year-old grandparents for being on this call. They are paying Startupy first friends and RSVP'd for this chat on their own merit. And that's just wonderful. So there's that. And just a few things, I think, for context on why we're hosting these product chats. I think a lot of the decision making and product thinking around the products that we use and love every day typically happens behind closed doors. And it's typically flawed humans making a lot of decisions. And I don't think it has to be that way. I think that having diversity of thought and perspective is really important. And I think that, when you're starting something with a tiny team, it's typically you losing yourself in your own thoughts, or in this case, Gabe, who's been my sounding board. But I really want to look at this group as an extension of our product team, and help us really think through some of the questions keeping us up at night. And hopefully we've chosen themes that are timely and hopefully interesting enough, and apply to some of the things you're working on as well. I realize Zoom might not be the ideal format for these conversations going forward. I want to make sure that they're unintimidating and inviting and informal. So if anyone has any ideas for where to host these in the future, if it maybe Clubhouse or something else, feel free to drop those in the chat. And then, yeah, so on to today's topic. I think that maybe to set some context, because I realize there might be varying levels of understanding of what Startupy is. Startupy really started as an Airtable database that I built for myself to make my life easier. I was pretty dissatisfied with my information environment, spending lots of time reading, but consuming it in environments that were really kind of stripping context and discouraging reflection. And so I wanted a place where I could store, archive, and retrieve, almost like an API for the things that were resonating with me. And it dawned on me that this would be a lot more powerful in a multiplayer setting. And so right now we're in the process of productizing Startupy, and transitioning from this kind of single player database to a multiplayer knowledge network. And as we do that, questions of social architecture and how to design the network to encourage the kinds of behaviors that we want become really important. And so the topic today is really around how to do that effectively, because I think that the tension that I see is that across networks that have achieved success, really a common thread is that they had status and reputation incentives built in early on, which isn't surprising because humans respond to incentives. But what is surprising is that a lot of these kind of design choices that we made were arbitrary. This idea that we are submitting our self-worth to numerical evaluation and using likes and follower counts as a proxy for status is a very kind of intentional design choice, and one that increasingly we've come to acknowledge isn't making us happier. It doesn't correlate with meaningful relationships or a sense of collective achievement, or all of the things that are good for us. And so thinking about how to create environments that are social, that respond to kind of human incentives, but that are also kind of anxiety free, is something that we think about a lot. And in particular, as I've gone down the rabbit hole of kind of understanding this world, a lot of the research that I've read shows that if we disincentivize follower counts, it also might lead to a more kind of widely distributed reputation benefits, because likes and follower counts, what they typically help skew towards these like superstar networks where rewards accrue to the top performers, and so there's just a lot of I think uh, unhealthy behaviors that these kinds of status games um, have led to. And I always come back to this quote by Jack Dorsey, which I'll read because, and I remember this stuck with me when I heard him speak on the Daily podcast. And he said, I'll read, "The disciplines that we were lacking in the company in the early days that I wish you would have understood and hired for were a game theorist to just really understand the ramifications of tiny decisions that we make, such as what happens with retweet versus retweet with comment, and what happens when you put a count next to a like button." And the reason that that stuck with me, I think, is because you think that these decisions were subject to a lot of kind of thought and evaluation, but the reality is that they were completely accidental and arbitrary in many ways. And so if you know, as I was kind of stepping back and preparing for this chat, I realized there are, I think, three things when it comes to status that are really important and that I want to keep in mind as we build this. The first is that I believe that curation as a form of status is underexplored. The act of collecting and organizing and structuring information and bringing to the public, to the public's attention, the things that are meaningful and worthy of our time, is a form of intellectual labor that is increasingly important, and one that I think is just underexplored in our information environments. And so, you know, that's something that is very important to us, is to honor that labor and that form of discovery. Um, the second point is that, you know, for us, Startupy was really born because we felt there was a lack of digital spaces that encouraged reflection and creativity and going down kind of intellectual rabbit holes, and that really were kind of tied to there's a difference between, I think, social media time, where everything is about, you know, refreshing and checking and real time, which is just slower and requires pauses, and and so for us, the thought of having numbers pollute the interface feels like counter to this idea of designing a space that encourages reflection. Um, and you know what one thing that I keep saying is we want something that people can use, not something that they're constantly checking. Because the act of constantly checking feels like something that has been designed intentionally to prey on our vulnerabilities, versus something useful that you come to because you actually need it in the moment. And then lastly, I think that there, you know, another, I guess, um, thing that I deeply believe is that our markets for reputation are actually highly inefficient. If you wanted to know, who's an expert in decentralized finance, for example, and you went on LinkedIn and somebody had in their bio DeFi expert, it's hard to trust that as like that self-credential. And a lot of these kind of intellectual conversations happen on Twitter, but because of the structure of Twitter, you can't really derive expertise on the network. If you were to visit Jesse Walden's profile, you can't really tell instantly that he's an expert in the ownership economy. Or if you were to visit Emily Singer's profile, who I know is here and writes a ton about consumer brands, it's not evident unless you've been following the person for a while that that's their area of expertise. And so I think that with the structure, the database structure that we've built for Startupy, there are ways to kind of surface expertise based on proof of authorship, proof of having read and curated and contributed to the network. And we find that that's something that's useful. It's a qualitative form of status. And just to ground that a little bit with a visual. So this is a screenshot of a sample topic page on Startupy. So creator monetization tools, this is just what you'd see above the fold. You can imagine having a ton of interesting startups and content below the fold, but at the top, there's an opportunity to really use this real estate to celebrate the top curators and the top authors. Now, I guess the challenge is how you define how people land these spots is very tricky, because if you do it based on quantity of posts, then it becomes very easy to game the system. If you limit it to a certain number of people, then it's very easy to quickly descend into zero sum games. And so just being thoughtful about how we design the way that we can. And by the way, this is just one form of status. Another form of status that we've that is uh, implicit in within Startupy is that everything that is added to the platform has a curator. So, for example, if you discovered Rome, the writing tool, a year and a half ago, currently, or if you've been reading Ben Thompson before he was a big deal, I mean, I think those things are underexplored, and there's a lot of design space there, and we have an opportunity with this network to to showcase who discovered whether a company or an author or a piece of content. But there are still a lot of, I guess, open questions around how to do that effectively. And so I guess I wanted to give that context before I open it up for discussion, because I think more broadly, what I'd love to learn from this group is, how, how should we be thinking about status and reputation incentives, and this idea of quantifiable versus qualitative status games. I'm curious also just what would motivate you to contribute to the network, and then more specifically, this concept of top authors and top curators, and the tensions we described there. I'd love to hear the group's thoughts on that. So I'll pause there, and hopefully, yeah, I'd love to hear people's opinions and perspectives. I realize with 60 people in the room, it's a little intimidating.
So
But
it looks like Jad's maybe raising his hand. I don't know if that's
oh,
there's
okay.
like the little emoji raise their hand, so maybe we could use that.
Oh, cool. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I can jump in, and you can raise your hand if you just go into reactions where the emojis are and click raise hand. That might be easier for you,
Oh,
Terry,
that's
to
Thank
help
you.
moderate the discussion. I think one thought that came to mind, I always look at Wikipedia as like an interesting use case of a platform that doesn't really have a lot of status games. And there's a really interesting study out of Cornell that talked about how simply thanking a contributor allowed them to come back and contribute more regularly, and to then go on and thank other people. So I'm not sure if there's something around showing appreciation or thanking contributors or curators that could be a really interesting kind of incentive mechanism.
That's interesting. Have you seen, is there like an example of a platform that has this kind of implicit thinking behavior that you can think of?
Um, well, nothing comes to mind, but I think, yeah,
Tipping.
nothing really comes to mind. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in.
You can tip on Twitch, for example. That's a form.
Yeah, I think tipping is an interesting one.
I would like to add to the Wikipedia thing actually and say that they don't really highlight contributors so publicly. So and also they don't really say this post belongs to a certain person. And I just read recently that actually this is what drives engagement on that platform, because it creates like some shared responsibility. So it's not one person's page, but everyone can contribute also really easily. You can just make an edit quickly and leave, and there's like, it's really super easy to do that, and so people don't really put much effort into it. So, but everyone kind of together helps evolve the pages. Yeah, it's never up to one person to create the whole content.
Wikipedia is fascinating. It almost feels like it runs counter to human behavior. I mean, the spirit of collaboration without any monetary or status incentive is fascinating. There's a bunch of people raising their hands. So I guess.
Yeah, I can go next. First off, thank you for putting this together. I think these are questions that most platforms should be asking, but aren't asking. So this is really meaningful. One thing I've been thinking about is discovery platforms, like Instagram, where you're sort of just scrolling and you don't really know what you're looking for, versus search engine based platforms, right? Like Google, like you have a very specific need when you go to Google to be able to find something. And I think I sense that that's a sentiment that we want to bring back, where instead of having this constant search, you're coming up with the original thought and you're looking to basically kind of find things that support or support that POV. As a research and analytics person, I think one thing to struggle with is even the search is biased, right? Most of the time, people aren't looking to disprove their thinking; they're looking to affirm their thinking. So, I one of the things, and I love Clubhouse. I love what it has to offer, but I'm continuing to see this ongoing trend of people who agree with each other having the same conversations and this echo chamber continuing. And I don't know if there's a way from like a platform standpoint to supplement two different opposing views, so that whatever the search engine returns isn't something that affirms what you're looking for, but alternatively gives a different point of view by an author that's obviously respectful, or someone whose opinion that you can respect, but I think more exposure to POVs that we didn't necessarily know of could be equally beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible point, and part of the reason why context is such an important part of what we're trying to bring to the platform. It's so easy to read a hot take and just click like without giving it further thought. But if you could see that alongside other perspectives on the same issue, it becomes easier to just be more thoughtful about the things that we read. So I love that point. Thanks for bringing it up.
I also really love that point and wanted to piggyback a little bit off of it, both kind of like threading a link between that point and the Wikipedia discussion, because I wonder if there's something about identifying as like, I am a Startupy, or this is my group. And then once you identify as the group, then your own status and your own reputation is already almost affirmed by being a part of that group. And so all you want to do is make sure that the group is better. And so then it allows you to potentially have more reflection. It allows you to listen. It allows you to actually be okay with potentially being wrong, because you've agreed to all of these additional kind of like requirements by being kind of like, by essentially aggregating your own identity to the group. And kind of like another piece of that I think is interesting is, while Goodreads, like, it looks terrible. I think that's just a fact. The interface is absolutely horrible. I do think that there is something about, like, the idea of having status, or the idea of having like quality, is like, you only really can post if you've read the book. And so that everybody who's posting has at least has some sort of base level, like, I guess, quality, or base level kind of like they know something. And so I'm just actually more interested and open when I'm reading their points on Goodreads. It's not like that I agree with all of them, but I actually just I read them and think about them. And so I think that might be an interesting point of what it looks like to kind of like presuppose quality as well.
Hi guys.
I was
This is- oh, Oh, go ahead.
Hi, this is Kaylee Adams. Hi. One thing that I keep coming back to also just in terms of reward and status is how Medium tackles their articles and how you can clap for different articles. It feels like the clap functionality is a nice way to reward people who are putting positive, interesting pieces of content out there into the world, because the clap feels like you almost agree with it and are, you know, supporting that opinion. I think that that kind of type of functionality could be really beneficial, because then it's less about how much a creator is producing, and it's more about what they're producing and how many people are kind of interested with what they have to say. And it still opens it up to, you could have multiple different contributors that have lots of collective claps or whatever that functionality is, but you know, having a way for that to bubble to the top so that certain creators themselves kind of bubble to the top just based off of the work that they've executed and produced could be a really interesting way to incentivize people.
I don't know. Someone else was gonna go, but
yeah. I was
wanna...
just gonna go back real quickly to the saying thank you thing. When I was at Waze, that was one of the biggest product decisions that we made. Was when you reported an incident on the road or cops ahead. There were two choices as far as you, if you're the driver who's approaching that incident. You could say it's not there anymore, or thank you. So it wasn't, it is there, it still is there. It was thank you. And adding the thank you, we actually saw the number of people who self-reported went up over the course of the next 3 or 4 months and never came back down. So it was because they knew that somebody else out there was benefited by the fact that they took the time to report that. So I thought that was, just going on the thank you side of things, the gratitude side of things. There was never, this is the number of people that thanked you. There was never, bonus points on your profile. There was never saying this person is a conscientious driver and a good, member of the Waze community. It was just that one moment of wow, somebody else out in the world benefited from what I was doing. And I think that's that was a really big piece of the puzzle. And, we had 800,000, math editors at the time that we sold to Google, and none of them made a single dollar ever. And they were all just doing it because of help, the idea that they could actually see the number of people who drove on roads that they changed. And so I think that there's a really interesting piece of the puzzle out there. But we called them our map editors, and they had a different login than everybody else, and that's the only thing that was different. As far as their status was concerned. So just a couple of things to think about without the status attachment to it.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, the gratitude piece, was that public, or just the editor would receive that, but there was no kind of public way to display how much gratitude someone received or anything like that, right?
Yeah, there wasn't. Yeah, just it was because there was the driver on the road who said, hey, there's a cop up ahead, and they got a thank you. And then there was the actual seeing the number of people driving on roads that you edited for the editor. So two different versions of gratitude. I think that another just a great example that I don't know if they still do it, but early on, Nest used to send out an email that had me, we, world. And that was something that I always thought was really interesting. So here's the number of amount of energy that you saved. Here's the amount of energy that the people in your neighborhood saved. And here's the amount of people who use Nest in the world saved. Right. And that was a really interesting thing to be able to see that your contribution added to those things. And going back to a point made earlier about being a part of this community of people that are conscientiously saving energy and doing better by the world just by installing a new thermostat on your wall. It gave you something to belong to. And I think that amongst everything that's happened on the internet, the tribalism is all rooted in things that are not necessarily constructive. And I think that the idea of building something that's more important than building it together is something that I think, there's a large appetite for.
Yeah. And Sadie, I think, and the rest of the group, Andy, you touched upon something that we talk a lot about, which is copy and lingo, and how that copy and that lingo may affect user behavior. And just to ground it into, I guess, what one of the questions on the screens, top curators and top authors just the change of the word top to just curators and authors may change drastically how the community of the group of people, of curators and authors, think upon themselves and their behavior. So what you bring up in terms, I think it's a really interesting point in terms of how it affects behavior and the metrics you're measuring.
Yeah, I guess just to add to this, what I was going to say as well is that in some ways, like the incentives almost don't matter in the same way when you're, because I'm coming to this platform because I have value in the platform being like full with great content that I can leverage. And so I almost wonder if what you need really from me is to know the stuff I care about and the stuff I'm interested about so that you can surface content for me that is going to be very relevant. And the way I can help you figure out what's relevant is that I can like stuff that I really enjoyed reading, or you can even see how much time I spent reading the article or engage with it. And that can feed back to you on like, okay, so the next person who's going to come who has this type of interest, she might also like that kind of content because that person liked it. And so you almost don't really need to have the whole like status game, because that's not really what I care about when I come there. I just care about having the most relevant content when I'm looking for something specific, because that's going to save me a ton of time.
Hi, I'll go. Hi, everyone. I wonder if there's a role for nomination here. So you can involve the whole community in nominating who they see as experts in a field or on a topic. And I think is it Talen's point earlier, which I thought was really interesting about ensuring that there's sort of opposing or a multiplicity of views on a topic. There can even be incentives for nominating people that represent various viewpoints on a topic. So in some ways, the nominators themselves can have status by the breadth and depth of their nomination activity. And then people that are nominated multiple times would somehow, kind of, rise to the top as experts in their field, either overtly or from an engine standpoint. And it makes me think of like product hunters, right? The hunters themselves have a lot of, authority on the platform. So I think it'd be interesting to engage the whole community in the act of nomination. It's also akin to me to the act of thanking, kind of pro-social behavior on the platform. So I don't know if you've thought about kind of just the idea of nomination.
Yeah, I love this idea of nomination and people suggesting curators and contributors. I see there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat in regards to the think versus like, the language difference there, and Lucas, it's an interesting point around whether it's the same status game except using gratitude as opposed to liking as the verb. I'm curious what you all think of that gratitude thread, and whether implicitly tying it to status could be a little dystopian or not.
I think that the most interesting thing that I forget the guy from Waze said that I loved, and I saw some of this in the chat too, was this like the fact that it's only, and I think maybe John is saying this now, that you're the only one who sees your things, or you're the only one who sees any of the feedback. I've been running this kind of like test on Twitter where I have normal tweets, but then I have basically a Zapier that connects to an Airtable database that I update with content that I'm interested in, and it has my comments on the Airtable database. Nobody can comment on it. Nobody can like it. It just tweets out like, Sydney has updated her Airtable database. And I get the most wonderful things in my DMs. And it's actually so much better than the random feedback I get from my random tweets on Twitter. And it's actually led me to continue. And I have a lot more pride in that, almost because it feels more purely mine than some of the other things where I feel like I'm almost like, not like my what I write is almost tailored to who I think will agree or who won't agree, or it's tailored for engagement. And so I think there's this thing around tailoring your, or like filtering your own thoughts towards engagement that I think is problematic.
100%, which is why I think that, you know, on Twitter, some people decide not to post something because they know and understand what gets likes and they don't think that'll get likes. And so just that level of self-consciousness is something we want to definitely avoid. I do love this idea of just certain things that only you see. Like, for instance, you don't have to see, you know, if you go to someone's profile, you don't necessarily see how many people are following them, but you can see that if you are following Sydney and Sydney is following Jad, and you go to Jad's profile, you could see Sydney is following Jad without necessarily having a number assigned to everything. I'm curious, you know, what you all think of the qualitative signals there.
This is Kaylee again. Just a quick thought on that. I like, to your point, sorry, I think that having some kind of tool where you where it's not necessarily a quantifiable number, but it's more about bubbling certain people up to the top who might be producing quality content. So while you can potentially like or clap for or whatever someone's content, the author would be the only one that would see that. So I think that to some extent, yes, it is kind of perpetuating, it's encouraging them to continue producing this similar type of content. But, you know, I think that having a way to surface those creators in a different way that's not based on just likes, but maybe it's something that's trending or something that's just people are finding interesting at the time would be really useful. And having that balance of how much of that feedback do you is just shown on the private level versus public. I think that too, one interesting thing, I think that Clubhouse is an interesting app, but I think someone said it really well earlier, where it's become quite an echo chamber for a lot of similar ideas. But one thing that they do pretty successfully, I think, is that they surface other people a little bit higher up to the top who are maybe connected. They're not the people on the stage who are speaking, but they're the people who are connected to them, part of their network. I think that building this as a network and trying to promote people who are producing quality content is going to be key. So maybe it's less about like who they know in their network, but it's more about the quality of what they're producing and putting out there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kaylee.
I just had one comment about quality and how we can break down, I guess, the definition of quality, because I think that I personally consume, obviously, so much content, like probably most of the group here. But then there's the content that I always consume, and I get something out of it, obviously, whether it's like entertainment. But then there's the content that I consume that might have a higher rank of quality for me that I'll be able to actually apply in a kind of day-to-day usage through like consulting that I do or through building my own business. And so that's where I might, like you mentioned Emily's newsletter. So I'm like an avid reader of Emily's newsletter, and I will always open it. And I have taken so much away from her analysis, whereas, there's many other newsletter authors that are probably similar to Emily's, won't name any names. And I also will read them and probably get a little bit out of them, but I would rank Emily's in higher quality because I'm able to take something away from it that I can apply in my day-to-day usage. So I would almost rank hers higher quality in that regard, but sometimes I actually don't know. Sometimes it takes me a week or two to actually synthesize that I would have ranked a newsletter at a higher quality, because it's not something, of course, you can rank something immediately after you consume it, But sometimes the higher quality consumption, you realize it's higher quality after you've had time to reflect and think about it, if that makes sense.
I love that. And I think one last piece on the quality piece is like, what is our definition of quality? That's such a broad definition. Like the way you were describing Emily's newsletter, it sounds really cool. And also, I'm a completely different person. Maybe I wouldn't think Emily's newsletter is that high quality. This is not personal, Emily. I'm sure your newsletter is great. But I just kind of think it goes back to that fundamental piece of what is quality.
Yeah. And also what you're just to add to that, I mean, like an easy analogy might be like TV, right? So I'll use like simple examples. Like I might have binged like The Flight Attendant on HBO because I needed like an escape. And I might have said, oh, that was high quality because I needed an escape. But to compare that to another television show, which I binged at the same frequency, like maybe The Queen's Gambit, it's hard to evaluate those. I might have consumed them at the same the same speed, but in order to evaluate those the quality of those, it's not even super equal, if that makes sense. It depends on what you need from it.
I think what Evan said is really great. A lot of what these instant responses to some posts or content is what creates an instant gratification, perhaps, and feeds into that system of like vulnerability and thinking not.
Sounds like it's cutting out a drop. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're cutting off here, Aylin. I see the chat there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the chat around reactions, which I think is really interesting because Instagram, Twitter, etc., bundle so many different things into a like, and you like different things for different reasons. I'm curious, from a UX perspective, are there any examples of platforms that have reactions? I know, Jad, you've explored a ton with using emojis for this kind of stuff to simplify. I love this conceptually. I think useful and insightful and thought-provoking are very different reactions. I'm curious if there are any examples anyone can point to.
I think from my experimentation around sort of reactions on content, it tends to be very understandable when it's a heart. Like people see the heart, they understand what it means, and they can respond. But when you give them a bunch of choice, it gets a little bit confusing, and it's really up for interpretation. Like how I interpret this emoji is very different to how David or Sydney or whoever would interpret that same emoji. So the like has just become like the canonical, like the basic, like fundamental way that you react to content. But I do agree that it is very limited. So that's just generally my take on that.
I was going to just mention something interesting, that like has kind of become the lowest common denominator. It is not what you want to express, but it is the least thing that you can express, because you do not know if the other emojis, for example, fit into the reaction that you want to communicate. So I thought that was very interesting. It's like a lowest common denominator way to react online. And if it's not there, then people are looking for other ways to do that. An interesting phenomenon I recently came across was this souffle application, which is very fascinating from a perspective of you're not disclosed who answered a question, but the only way it's disclosed is when you upvote or downvote. So the reputation is not there. So for example, the same famous person said something about strategy of product development. You do not know it is the person with the 1 million followers on Twitter, or is someone who has 10 followers. And they did this little analysis where people who had the most followers on Twitter actually do not have the most upvoted answer when you hide their identity or their reputation in those cases. So I thought they had a very interesting phenomena where the only way you find out who the person said it was after you commented or upvoted that answer. So it took the bias away from someone's great reputation, like a Nawal Ravi Khan or or a Serena Williams or anything like that. So I thought that was a very fascinating way to actually get towards your curiosity that, oh, that answer is interesting, or that question is interesting, before you even know what you're trying to upward or downward. I thought that was a very fascinating example of behind the scenes in a way that you upward quality without getting biased by anything around that.
I do have a return question to kind of add to what you mentioned. I wonder that I totally echo everything that Sarah you brought up about the problems of us having counters and actually counting popularity. But I wonder, what did we actually get out from that? Is it the safety that knowing that this person has done something and is now speaking from experience? Is it that they've kind of been proven? So I know that the counter cannot necessarily reflect quality, but it can be a signal of certainty. So I wonder if some of these signals become invisible, or if you cannot see who is someone who is an expert in the field. How do you judge someone just making a comment or someone actually speaking from experience and having done something themselves?
I think that's such an interesting question, is whether, because we can sit here and complain about likes and follower counts, but they, in many ways, they do, they are a proxy for quality, and there are some implications around hiding that. One thing that I keep coming back to is, I think that a lot of these early social networks were designed around completely eliminating friction, and so anyone can post, and so I wonder if adding friction to the actual distribution, who is allowed to distribute content, perhaps at that point you don't need follower counts as a way to signal quality, because there's some sort of friction associated with, it's funny that on Twitter most of the content comes from 5% of the accounts, and a lot of the trolling happens from accounts that are not super active. And so, I think that in this world where we've eliminated friction, what does it mean to introduce friction, and what are the implications that might have, is something that we keep coming back to also.
I think adding on that point is also, on Twitter, you only really have reach if you have a lot of followers, right? So that doesn't really motivate anyone to contribute if they don't have a lot of followers. So, and if on that platform you would be able to share an interesting idea, more actually maybe similar to TikTok, where it doesn't matter if you have followers or not, they show your content to a few people, and then if you get great reactions, then they distribute it further through the network. And so it's basically really only the quality of the content and not how many followers you have. And I think that would also encourage better content on the platform.
That's a great point.
I have a really quick follow-up to that, which is almost like a lot of the work that I do, I end up just putting into little walled gardens, whether it's my iCloud Drive where I'm saving a bunch of screenshots, or I'm just using Pocket and using a tagging system in there. And so I'm sure that the sort of internet super collectors, which probably we over-index on, are probably engaging in some activity like this. And so there's some sort of inherent personal reward where we could also be contributing to the community. Then it's less about trying to gamify community rewards and that external validation. But if it has this sort of way of connecting to otherwise independent nodes into this network, I'd love to share what I'm finding with the larger group if there was just an easy way to do so that didn't mean putting things into a new walled garden that meant I had to duplicate my own work.
Yeah, and I keep coming back to the point that Andy made earlier about the self-reporting piece, and it started to, because I think what we're talking about here is there's basically two types of actions, right? There's the contributor action, and then there's also the person who is consuming it. How are they going to react to it, and what does that signal look like, and what do all things look like? And I think I kind of think of it as three different buckets in terms of how a person can interact with content, right? Like you have the active participant where whatever signal you put in front of them, they'll use that signal to indicate whatever you want them to indicate. And then there's also the passive consumption, right? Where they're engaged, they've read the whole thing and they're passively engaging with the piece of content. You don't know what it's prompting them to do, in their life or whether it's actionable enough, but nonetheless, they're engaging with it. And then there's the lurkers, right? Where no matter what signal you put in front of them, they're just not, there's no emotional trigger to get them to interact with that content or to get them to engage with the platform specifically. And I think most platforms are designing with the active participants in mind, when the emotional and the psychographic triggers of the lurkers and the people who are passive are totally different. Like going back to Andy's example, the people who are self-reporting, that makes me think about what did their psychographic profile and that emotional trigger to self-report, does that look different than someone who may be like a lurker or someone who's passively consuming?
That's a great point.
This makes me kind of go back to thinking about like, what is the point of status anyway, I guess, in the Startupy platform? And I think the comments that we've made fall into different categories that might lead you to different conclusions. Like, one role of status is to aid in discovery, right? To help users find content that's relevant and high quality, however that's defined. And then another role of status we've talked about is to reward and incentivize contribution. And then maybe a third one that we've talked about is to aid in actually vetting one's ability to contribute, or welcome, like whether someone's welcome to contribute based on the quality and appropriateness of their content. So whether it's for vetting or aiding discovery or incentivizing contribution, I think there's different answers. And given that it's all a virtuous cycle of giving feedback and using that feedback to aid in discovery and to disincentivize, it gets tricky because it's one cycle that feeds different things, the incentivizing and the discovery. So I think about what's most important as you think about the platform. Is it about like where you are now? Is it about aiding in discovery and helping to sift through content, or is it more about encouraging contribution to build the content?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think I find that the incentive piece is more important in the sense that because we are so search driven, in many ways, I mean, finding the signal through the noise will be important. So on the discovery side, there are lots of things that we are doing and thinking about that are independent, I would say, of status. I think one thing we're leaning on is this idea of number of connections. If something is mentioned in lots of places in the database, and it's a very kind of idiosyncratic metric that's very unique to our database. So I would say like the discovery side is important, but is secondary to the incentive side. I'm more interested in understanding how important is status as an incentive. I think today, I heard a lot of things like belonging and gratitude and feelings of collective achievement are really important, and those things are less they're not necessarily captured by a top curator. There could be many other ways to introduce those kinds of incentives. But yeah, I think the most important thing for me is the incentives and whether it's whether the way we've been thinking about status is the right incentive, or introducing things like gratitude or a lot of the other ideas that came up today might be more effective.
And how it relates to scaling and scaling with quality, however we define it, right?
This may be a somewhat unrelated concept, but I'm wondering if instead of status, like belonging in terms of like identities, like a binary, like I either am part of this community or not. Using something like streaks, like I'm wondering if instead of people wanting to share all the time, there could be something like every month you get a prompt, or every week you get a prompt like what's the best thing you've read, or like what's something you want to share based on what you've learned. And that could extend from what I think someone was saying earlier in terms of it being like a natural extension of the work that people are already doing in their own walled gardens. And then people can kind of contribute in a way that, you know, every month or every time they get this reminder, it's like, oh yes, Startupy is something that I contribute to. And then that's kind of the incentive, is like, am I like continuing to participate in this instead of thinking every single time I read something like, is this something I'm going to share? Am I going to build my status on this other platform?
Yeah. Lucas, that's a great point on what did my work contribute to? Because I think that often, like, you know, a good piece of writing can inspire you to do so many different things, and as an author, you rarely kind of know what people, you know, what you inspired people to do. I'm curious, you know, if anyone has any thoughts on how that kind of idea could be productized.
I think also, if maybe hundreds of people read your article, you don't need an explicit feedback from all of them. But if you would just like get a few feedbacks that are very concrete, that already give you some appreciation. So maybe after reading an article, or after reading 5 articles on the same topic, and you maybe like a few, then the platform could prompt you and be like, seems like you're really into this topic right now. What are you working on? And then you could share, like, enter, yeah, I'm doing research on this, or I'm doing this and that. And then this gets sent back to the contributors on that topic, for example, or it just shows under the article, like, okay, people that are consuming this content, they are like doing this and that, or working on X project.
Yeah, someone on this call already was referencing Emily Singer's newsletter and how they gathered so much from it, and it took maybe a few weeks of reading it before they started, you know, having ideas kind of snowball. And I think to Lucas's point, it's really interesting how over time you get this value, but maybe that person has never actually reached out. I forget who shared that earlier, to Emily. Maybe they never have responded by email and said anything to her. And I think it's interesting on this call that just kind of already happened naturally. So yeah, Lucas, I think it's interesting to kind of, you know, turn that into a feature, productize that a little bit, where as you engage more and more, at some point it's like, hey, it seems like you're really benefiting from this. Maybe you should give thanks, or whatever the other mechanism is that you create.
And it would be also so interesting to see how your ideas travel through a network, right? Maybe you have like lunch with a friend, you tell them about something and you recommend an article, but then you never know what they do with this. But if through this platform, you could be like, in the end, okay, through this 3 nodes in the network, I don't know, this morning Elon Musk was reading my article and he actually liked it, and I'm like, wow, okay, it actually reached like some important person or so.
I think, to Lucas's point, and I think the last person's point too, what is interesting too is like the aggregation of what does a like mean, what does a heart mean, what do all these things mean, and like this training of how to give feedback might be useful. Like maybe what the like means is that to someone that like, oh, I liked it because I actually did use your tweet to turn into this, to like spearhead this entire project. And then to somebody else is like, oh, I liked your tweet just because I had nothing else to do that day. And so how do you kind of like coach people into giving feedback that's actually useful, both for the person who's giving the feedback, but also the person who's creating the content, so that it reinforces the definitional kind of like high quality content that we want to see.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we really have conflated likes with so many, like when I like things on Twitter, for me, it's a way to kind of store and bookmark things, so I can then go back to them later. I do love this idea of introducing gratitude in some way, and feedback. I think that the tension with all of these things is kind of simplicity and ease of use, and um, you know, in many ways, I think that when you think about something like a Clubhouse, it's almost like they do one thing that's different and better, but they preserve a lot of the UX patterns of traditional social networks. And so, one thing I'm curious about is like if you undo a lot of these very familiar UX patterns, um, considering people are so drawn to the familiar, what are the potential repercussions there when there is no familiar like button or follow button, and you're just introducing a whole new set of design patterns. But anyway, this has been an incredibly fruitful conversation. I know we're coming to the hour, so if anyone wants to add any parting thoughts, otherwise I'm gonna try to summarize some of the insights from this call and circulate them to everyone, because there's just been a lot of great stuff. And in true startup-y spirit, you sometimes only get to the actionable stuff once you're able to reflect on everything. So thank you all for coming and showing up and sharing some great ideas.